Hello and welcome back to Early Modern Philosophy. I am Andy, philosophy lecturer, and today we want to talk about Leibniz. If you missed the previous episodes, we have been talking about Descartes, about Spinoza, and we will go through all these early modern philosophers one by one and try to sort out what they wanted and how their philosophies worked. And this is a very exciting period because I love this period because it's not so technical like today's philosophy. Today's philosophy is often about very small points in very difficult arguments that are hard to follow, that require a lot of technical knowledge about what the one person has written, what the other person has written. While early modern philosophy is, like perhaps the pre-Socratics also, a time where people were just going out, with totally new ideas, trying to solve problems that nobody had thought about before. And they made up original and forceful and strong solutions. And this is a liveliness in their philosophy, right? And a strength in this philosophy that is really great and inspiring to read today. And so Leibniz is the next one we need to talk about. And Leibniz is a very weird one. And I mean, many of these people are very weird, right? It is exactly like I said, you have all these people struggling, to solve these problems in their own way. And their own ways are often very strange ways, right? And so this is what happens with all of these. I'm looking there, I have a table there of their dates. It's also interesting to see the dates. I will put them on the screen. So first comes Descartes, then Spinoza was born approximately the same time as Descartes. He was a generation younger. Newton is a few years younger than Spinoza, and then you have Leibniz, almost the same age as Newton. And Leibniz and Newton being the same age actually became a problem for Leibniz later because Leibniz developed calculus in mathematics, and Newton developed calculus in mathematics, and probably they did so independently because they were the same age. It was the time when calculus, would have been discovered by someone. It's often like this, right? When an age is right, then things happen. And often the same thing happens independently. Two different researchers come up with the same thing. We've seen this many times in the history of science. The DNA structure was also discovered, by multiple people at the same time. In the end, Watson and Crick got all the recognition for it, but there were others who were contributing very much to it, but then never mentioned. Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins and many others. So it is often like this, one person gets all the fame, but in reality, it is the time, it is the development of science that would have led to this discovery anyway. And so poor Leibniz, because Newton got more of the fame for calculus, poor Leibniz was always fighting to be recognized as one of the people who developed calculus, and he disliked Newton, and this did not help him because the English then, who thought that Newton discovered calculus, and obviously they would because he was one of them, they disliked Leibniz because they thought he is trying to steal the attribution for this discovery. He was trying to pretend that he discovered it, although it was Newton's. And Leibniz, on the other hand, was bitter because he knew that he had done it himself and Newton got all the recognition. So they were quarreling about this for the rest of their lives. Anyway, here we are not so much interested in Leibniz mathematics, although you cannot separate it from the person. Leibniz was, often it's said, the last universal scientist. He was the last person who was an expert in everything, because after this early modern time, slowly the sciences started diverging, and if you wanted to be a good physicist or a good mathematician, you needed, again, so much technical knowledge that you did not have time to also be a good biologist and to be whatever, a good, chemist. So you would have to concentrate on one thing. While previously, throughout the Middle Ages, in ancient times, you just were a scientist and a philosopher, as they were called often. And a philosopher would be all these things at once, right? But this was not the case anymore after Leibniz. So Leibniz was a mathematician, he was a philosopher. He also was very much influenced by the discovery of the microscope and the developments there, where you could look through the microscope and see all these little things that the eye could not see, the fine structure of, not of matter, because the microscopes at this time, they were essentially just magnifying glasses, but you could still see things that you did not see with the naked eye. So you could see the cells in plants, right, which have cell walls, and you could clearly see the internal structure of a plant having all these cells and their walls and how they are connected with each other. So this was very impressive for Leibniz. He saw that the world is composed by all these little units which you could not see with your eyes and your common sense. But now it turns out this is the reality, this is how the world works. And Leibniz felt that philosophy should follow this lead of the microscope. We should see that things are often not as they look, and that there might be some microscopic world, even in the realm of philosophy, that determines how the macroscopic things are. And so the macroscopic appearances are not necessarily trustworthy, but they are just what we can see. And if we had better instruments, we might see a much higher complexity at a smaller level, which is now hidden from us because we lack the right tools to see it. And this also played very well with the general feeling at this time, which was that philosophy should follow the lead of the sciences. Philosophy should be a science. It should be as reliable as a science. It should have as good results as sciences do. And so they were all striving for this, and this is why, Newton was a physicist and a philosopher. Descartes was a mathematician and a philosopher and a biologist, you could say, in a way. And Leibniz also was a physicist, a mathematician, and a philosopher. Leibniz was a very bright child. He entered university at 15, got his PhD when he was 20, but then he did not continue with an academic career. So many of these early modern philosophers were not academics because the academic world was still very strongly influenced by the Middle Ages, by scholastic philosophy, and they felt, that their new ideas would not fit into the scholastic framework. They did not fit, so they would get pursued by the church, to change their ideas, and they would be considered not fitting and not serious academics because they have this totally different way of seeing things, and they would be sidelined anyway in academia, so it was easier for them to get out of it and do their own thing outside. Leibniz was very active in very many different areas. And he was interested in religion, he was interested in statecraft and politics, he was interested in history, he was interested in mathematics. And all this meant that he was so busy doing all these different things. It's a thing we also have today, some of us, right? This shiny thing syndrome where you have something new and shiny and you immediately run after it and you abandon whatever you were doing before. And Leibniz seems to have been suffering from this also. So he left a lot of his works unfinished because he could not concentrate on one thing and finish it, and he was jumping around from one to the next thing. Leibniz was one of the first Westerners to study Chinese philosophy and culture, so by then the contact to the Chinese had been established through the Silk Road, and there were also of course, the English were traveling to India with the East India Company, and then they had contacts with China, over India and their maritime empire. And so Leibniz really admired the Chinese, their history, their culture, and he thought it was superior to the Western culture, which it was throughout, the Middle Ages, and especially the Dark Ages before the Middle Ages, right, were a pretty barbaric time in the West, while the Chinese at the same time had their tongue poems, calligraphy, beautiful paintings, music, all these arts that were never developed in the West through the Middle Ages. By the time the West had its Renaissance, with the art of the Renaissance and everything that followed, music, Baroque, Bach, and all this explosion of culture in the West, by that time, Chinese culture was already 500, 600, 700 years old. And it was a great, wonderful culture. And so Leibniz saw that, And he always thought that instead of us going to send, missionaries to China to make them Christian, they should send missionaries and try to civilize the West. So this is just a funny story about Leibniz and about how important actually and how valuable Chinese culture was back then. So because Leibniz was so busy, his in all these different areas, his works are often incomplete, and much of his philosophy we actually don't know from his books, but we know it from letters that he wrote to people with whom he corresponded. And in the letters he explains his ideas, and so sometimes these letters are the only way to understand his philosophy better. Bertrand Russell, the historian of philosophy, says about Leibniz, and I will read you from here. He says, Leibniz had a good philosophy which he kept to himself, and a bad philosophy which he published with a view to fame and money. His bad philosophy was admired for its bad qualities, and his good philosophy, which was known only to the editors of his manuscripts, was regarded by them as worthless. I think, Russell says, it is probable that as he grew older, he forgot the good philosophy which he had kept to himself and remembered only the vulgarized version by which he won the admiration of princes and even more of princesses. Here as elsewhere, Leibniz fell into Spinozism whenever he allowed himself to be logical. In his published works, accordingly, he took care to be illogical. So this is a very biting statement by Russell, and Russell is a lot of fun to read, so you should read the History of Western Philosophy for exactly this reason, right? Because Russell is so much fun when he comments on other philosophers. But the point here is that Leibniz fell into Spinozism whenever he allowed himself to be logical. And this is exactly the thing, right? Because if you remember Spinoza, there is only one substance, and this having one substance makes sure that we can have an interaction between things, while otherwise it's not clear how mind and body would interact. And so Leibniz feels that this is the problem also, right? How can mind and matter interact? But Leibniz does not want to go as far as Spinoza and say that God is everything, God is the only substance, and we are all parts of God. This did not end well for Spinoza historically, right? He was kicked out of his Jewish community. He was forced to go and live in another town where he became a lens grinder, and eventually he died from a lung disease. He got through that. So this was nothing you wanted to emulate. Leibniz wanted the courts of the princes and princesses, and he wanted to be accepted, and he wanted to be famous. And this is why he had his quarrel with Newton. So he was not somebody who would happily, go out of society and do his thing and grind lenses and keep his philosophy intact. He was somebody who wanted to, in some extent, the recognition, and he was ready to sell out his philosophy or to water it down in order to get the recognition he wanted. So Leibniz tries to solve the problem of mind-body interaction. How does the mind interact with the body? How do I get impressions from the outside that cause ideas in my mind, and how can my mind make my hand move, for example? How can my mind, which is an immaterial thing, move my material hand, right? And Spinoza had said it's all one. Leibniz kind of also says it's all one, but it's a different kind of thing. Because, remember the microscope, he was influenced very much by this idea that the world is put together by these small units, the cells, the atoms, perhaps, of ancient Greek philosophy. And, of course, he couldn't see any atoms with a microscope of the time, but the atoms were already known from Democritus and other ancient Greek philosophers. And so what he wants to do is a philosophy based on a kind of atomic theory, and he calls his atoms monads. Monads is a word that comes from Greek. Monos means soul, alone, one. It has various meanings, all related to being one, being a unit, being something that is one only. And so the monads are one thing. They are indivisible. They are in this sense like atoms. But atoms normally we think of as, different kinds, but they're all kind of the same material. But for Leibniz, this is not true of monads. Monads are hierarchical. So they have different kinds of monads. They're very simple monads, and they're very complex monads. And the very simple monads are unconscious. They are just really material, like material atoms or molecules. And then the more complex monads have consciousness, and they have a soul. And the most complex monad, the most powerful monad is God, right? And so God is always there, of course, right, in all these early modern philosophers. And the most powerful monad is God, but God is also just a monad. So everything is monads. And these monads now, Leibniz says, represent the universe from their own perspective. And how do I have to understand this? This is an important thought to him, that every monad contains the knowledge of the whole universe from its own perspective. And how this works in this way, think about it. If I see this camera, right? This camera in front of me has plastic parts around the lens, some kind of plastic. So where does this plastic come from? This plastic comes from oil. Where does the oil come from? The oil comes from the ground where it's taken out in Saudi Arabia or something. Where does the Saudi Arabian oil come from originally? It comes from ancient forests that were there, and then they were covered by, ground, earth. And down there in the depths of the earth, they slowly transformed over millions of years into oil. And so when I now have this camera in front of me and I look at a piece of plastic, this piece of plastic actually goes back materially to these ancient forests. It goes back materially to the dinosaurs. This piece of plastic, this atom, has probably seen a dinosaur. It has probably seen the extinction of dinosaurs. It has seen before that the creation of the Earth. It has come to Earth from a meteorite, from space perhaps, right? And eventually it was part of the Big Bang at some point. So we're not concerned now with the physical reality of these things and where the elements come from and the atoms come from. But the idea of Leibniz is that if these monads are indestructible, then each one has a trajectory through the whole history of the universe. Its existence is eternal, and so through eternity, it has always been part of one thing or another. It has seen the universe's development. It has seen the whole world come into existence, develop, change. And it has seen this from its own perspective, from being part of a dinosaur, being part of an ancient forest. After the dinosaur died, perhaps its body decomposed and the forest grew. The forest was destroyed, it became oil. The oil was extracted, it became plastic. And now this same part of this dinosaur is part of my camera. And so every single thing, every monad is an individual that is indestructible and has been around since the creation of the world. Eternity not necessarily, but the creation of the world. And since the creation of the world, it has had its own trajectory that is unique. And so each monad is not interchangeable. One atom is not like the other. The one atom of plastic might be from an ancient dinosaur. The second atom of plastic might be from a meteorite that fell from space. The third atom of plastic might in reality come from some ancient ocean, be part of a fish. We don't know. Right? And they all somehow managed to end up in the same part of this oil, which later, became the plastic for this camera. But they can have totally different origins. They have totally different trajectories. And so this is what he means when he says that each monad represents the universe from a unique perspective. A unique perspective. No second monad can have the same trajectory through the universe, because then it would be identical with the first monad. And the same applies to everything. Alexander the Great, right, is a name for what we consider in general. But the monads that put together Alexander the Great were already there before, and they had their own existence. And if we knew where every, let's say in modern parlance, molecule of Alexander the Great comes from, we would have a unique description of the universe from the viewpoint of these monads, of these molecules. Although, of course, be careful, a monad is not a molecule, right? A monad has a soul, while the molecule is not. But just to have a picture that we can imagine a little better today. And this is what Leibniz calls the complete individual concept of Alexander the Great. So the complete individual concept is all the knowledge of all these things that make up Alexander the Great, of all these monads, and where they have been before, and what their trajectory through the universe is. And if we knew this, the complete concept of Alexander the Great, we would be God, because only God knows this. Only God knows where all these things have been before, and also where they will be in the future. Because the monads interact with each other in a physical way, in a necessary way, they cannot do anything else. Like the atoms, they will move around according to the laws of physics. In Leibniz world, there is no randomness, there is no quantum mechanics. If you want, there are things are happening, necessarily from physical causes. And so the universe at every point is determined and is as it must be because of what happened before. And what happens in the next moment is also predetermined because, according to the laws of nature, we know what will happen next. We could know. We don't know because our knowledge is not good enough, but God knows. So now everything is predetermined. And so we end up again with Spinoza in a determined world, and you see where the Spinozism comes from that Russell talks about. We end up with a world that is totally determined. We are not free. But now the question is, okay, if it's totally determined and we are not free, what really happens with our senses, with our knowledge of the world, and with our minds? And Spinoza thought we have this freedom of the mind that's a little mysterious. Why do I have a freedom of the mind? Why can I decide to follow my affects or to, submit to the reality of the world? And Leibniz says, yeah, this does not really work. So in reality, not even our thoughts are free. Everything is predetermined. And if everything, including my thoughts, is predetermined, then why do I even need to have any impressions from the outside world? Why do I even need to see the camera? There's no point in me seeing anything, because what do I do with it? Nothing. Whatever happens in my mind is predetermined anyway. So there is no need to have any senses, to have any impressions. So all my senses are in reality illusions. Everything is predetermined by God at the beginning of the universe. God put everything together for all future. God knew exactly how things would develop, how the universe would develop. God could foresee the whole trajectory of the universe. And being able to see that, he adjusted everything in every little detail, so that when now I say I want to move my hand and my hand moves, there is no hand. There is no wanting. God has put back then, 13.7 billion years ago, if the physicists are right, or 6,000 years ago, if the Bible is right, God has put into my mind the idea, the thought that at this moment I will want to raise my hand. And God has made it so that my hand will rise at exactly the same moment when I think this. And this is what Leibniz calls the pre-established harmony. The pre-established harmony of the universe is that everything is pre-established. So this harmony is pre-organized, and there is no way to escape it. But if everything is pre-established, then what would my senses even do? Why would I even want to have senses? Why would I want to interact with anything? I would only disturb God's plan, right? If I could raise my hand voluntarily or push something with my hand, I would just disturb this pre-established harmony. So in reality, we cannot do any of these things. We don't perceive anything and we don't act. It's all just in our minds, in our soul monad. And our sole monad in reality, and now we come to Leibniz's statement, defining statement. Monads don't have windows. And this means that a monad cannot see anything. It's not open to the world. It doesn't get any sensory impressions in. And it doesn't put any actions out. A monad does not have windows. A monad interacts only in ways that have been, at the point where the universe was created, pre-established by God into this harmonious universe that we see, and everything is predetermined, and our monads are going to do what they are doing because of God's pre-programming. And pre-programming is the right word. You can see this very much as we would today a computer program. You have a simulation in a computer of a world in all its detail. The simulated people go around, do things, think of Minecraft, right, where you have these little villagers moving around, and whatever they do is pre-programmed by the guy who programmed the simulation. There is no freedom at all. They are all going to do their thing, but if they were conscious, they would be thinking that they are free. They would be thinking that they are in the real world, that they are doing something real, but it's not. Whatever they do is pre-programmed. Even their thoughts are pre-programmed. All is just the pre-established harmony of God. And now, if all is this pre-established, of course, we don't have freedom. And then the question is, where does the evil actually come from? Because now you get into a theological problem. So far, so good, this theory solves many problems of epistemology. For example, how we know things. We don't know things. God has just given us all what we think is knowledge. How do mind and body interact? They don't interact. Monads don't have windows. Everything happens because it's predetermined. So these are all solutions to the problem. You would say, we would say today, Leibniz theories are necessarily counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't it be easier if monads had windows? Yeah, but if you're Leibniz, you would say no, because if monads have windows, then we would get all sorts of interferences in God's plan. Then the monads could see things that they shouldn't, and they could do things that they shouldn't, right? It's important that everything does only what God wants it to do. Now, the problem with this is you get into a theological problem, because if God has predetermined everything, then how can we sin? How can we be responsible for our actions? And why does evil exist? Right? That's a problem. Why does evil exist in the world? And this problem of evil is called the theodicy. And this comes from theos and dike. Dike means the judgment of God or the justice of God. And theos is God, right, in Greek. So theodicy is the justice of God, the judgment of God. Why do I have evil in a world that is pre-programmed by God? And this we will talk about in the next episode. So make sure to come back for Leibniz's theodicy. Thank you, and see you there.